All right, Martin,
Hello.
welcome. Um,
Thank you.
yeah, so honored to have you here. Thanks for taking the time. I don't know if you've been how long you've been tuning in, but it's been quite an event. Yeah, it's been quite an event. It's been very exciting, and I'm really excited to get your voice and perspective woven into this sort of dialogue that's been taking place over the past couple of hours as we've launched mainnet for Region Ledger, which is very exciting. And we've been talking to land stewards, we've been talking to scientists, we've been talking to blockchain engineers and funders and different people in the ecosystem, and I wanted to invite you to just kind of do what you do so well, which is frame out the necessity and opportunity for coherent, nested global carbon accounting, and just chat with everybody about that, because the work that you're doing at Open Earth Foundation is something that's been a big inspiration to us, and that we're excited to both support and contribute to and learn from. So I just sort of wanted to give our community a real just glimpse of this emerging world of carbon accounting and the role of distributed ledger technology and open source approach to science and technology. So with that kind of introduction, I'd love it if you just introduced yourself a little bit and Open Earth Foundation, and then we can get into the meat of the climate accounting challenge.
Great. Well, you can see in my smile, I'm super excited to be here, very honored, and congratulations to you and the whole Region team. Very important day, and it's special for me to be able to echo any thoughts that I have to the broader community. And I think the different conversations you've been having also depicts how important Region is as a very important ecosystem organization, and forming part of a cohort of ecosystem organizations that has to think holistically about what you do. And you've been such a remarkable initiative on this. I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Martin Weinstein. I've been working in the climate and energy space for a couple of decades, and my work kind of crosses academia and entrepreneurship, but mostly on taking a systems-based approach to solutions to planetary challenges. I started the Open Innovation Lab at Yale University around 3 or 4 years ago, where we started incubating a lot of the models and how do we tackle very big challenges that a lot of solutions out there are a little bit siloed. A lot of stakeholders are still not fully connecting and collaborating. What's the role that universities and research labs can play on this? And the focus has been on the intersection between emerging digital technology with IoT, AI, and blockchain being on the frontier of that, but also the role that open source, digital infrastructure, and multiple stakeholders collaborating on that open space connect to address those holistic, let's say, systems-based solutions. After 3 years operating the lab, and I still, let's say, lead some of the work there, the projects with the international climate and carbon accounting being a very important gap that we identified, and I'll talk a little bit about what led to there, made it an imperative that we kind of spin off the university to be able to scale independently, and that's led to the launch of the Open Earth Foundation that we started last year, and this year sort of formally scaling out. And that in a nutshell kind of describes what my different hats have been. But the path on the importance of holistic and robust integrated climate accounting started when, for the last decade, really have been working on energy. But while I was doing my PhD, I collaborated a lot with a lot of the scientists that work on calculating the carbon budget. And so that's the physical amount or the physical space in the atmosphere that we can still pump greenhouse gas emissions before we achieve climate tipping points, 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. It's the science of that and the framework of the carbon budget that informs the Paris Agreement. And then from the Paris Agreement sort of trickles down into the actions that countries need to do. But in many ways, we can think about our planetary carbon budget as a single account that we all share as individuals, as organizations, and we need to manage. It's kind of having an Earth credit card, but we don't really have proper accounting. We don't have proper control on what we're doing, and we've been withdrawing more than we should. And distributed ledger technologies and peer-to-peer platforms ideally can help us better coordinate that shared resource and management. So that led into a whole research pathway. How can technology help us manage those global commons better? But then following the line into policy, international policy, and the Paris Agreement. Now, the Paris Agreement really is an agreement between countries and the UNFCCC. So it presumes that countries represent all non-state actors, cities, states or provinces, countries, and civil society and people. So in the process, the second insight on being able to explore how DLTs, distributed ledger technologies, can help on tracking global budgets, a key part is how do we drive incentive mechanisms, which is also something that Regions have been doing since day one. How do we link robust accounting with financing? And how do we ensure that in the process, it empowers the right people, that it disintermediates and automates and therefore reduce the cost of connecting these things. And that applies directly with what Regions have been doing, establishing ecosystem service credits and how that relates to people on the ground and what are the finance mechanisms for it in a way that it allows a space for us to define rules that also have to adapt constantly. Can't bring a top-down approach to it, but also a way in which once, let's say, if we think purely on the voluntary carbon market side of things, when a credit is generated, it's verified in a methodology, and that methodology has also been approved by the community, and it's retired, as in taken off the market. How do we make sure that ends up rolling up to a national inventory? Because that's what makes it part of the Paris Agreement. And the accounting space has evolved in a siloed way, right? So the countries do their inventory, they ingest a lot of CSV files and put it together and sends it over to the UNFCCC, and the UNFCCC receives all these Excel spreadsheets and PDFs. But at the same time, companies now more and more do their accounting, CDs as well, and the voluntary carbon market evolving on the side with its own independent standards, independent registries, ideally needs to fit into that process, officially or unofficially. So we've been exploring this space, and there's more I can say. Obviously, we can dive a little bit more into the details, but hopefully, Gregory, that helps establish a bit of where our focus has been, and maybe you can lead on where you want us to guide some of the sound bites about this space.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I think that's a really great overview of a little flavor of your history and then the larger context of global carbon accounting and where we're at. So I'd love to just chat maybe about. I mean, there's a couple of different places. One is, obviously reconciling global stocktake, national stocktake, subnational carbon accounting. This is a big set of problems. It's data standards. It's there's trust issues. There's all of these things. What in your sort of applied research and innovation, what is the role of distributed ledger technology in this sort of nested accounting challenge specifically? Like what does having a distributed ledger between stakeholders enable us to do in that kind of global stock take process on an annual basis to keep us on track do that, a bunch of people sending CSVs to the UNFCCC doesn't do? Why is this a direction that you're putting a lot of attention to, and why is it kind of maybe something hopeful around our ability to keep track of the balance sheet for Earth?
Yeah, that's a great place to start, and I'll give a first stab at it. But my response to these questions has evolved over time, and it's possible that 5 minutes from now I'll be like, oh wait, I forgot to add this thing to what you asked.
Yeah.
I'll start with, the important thing is that being able to do data audit trails. And, when you say something or you have a claim, where does it come from? And what were the agents involved into that? And when I say agents, are you using satellite data? That's an agent. Are you using sensors on the ground? That's an agent. And an official person that went to the site and reviewed something as well. And then how did that create a data ecosystem that goes towards that claim, and that a third party can go and review, and that third party doesn't necessarily have to be a human. It could also be an agent machine that goes in and looks at all the information that's connected to that claim. Then that claim is a structure that also has to define all the information that gives itself its value based on what it's attesting. And so trust, let's say, or being able to have transparency is a very important part. And that, in many ways, is one of the key things about the Paris Agreement. Article 13 is around transparency. But at the same time, the DLT space has brought in cryptographic tools to allow transparency alongside privacy. And that's very important because we have to be transparent, but it doesn't mean that everything we do is totally out in the open, everyone can see everything. But certain agents within a framework need to be able to have that capacity. And that's becomes more and more important in the private sector, which obviously it's definitely protective of certain data sets. So data audit trail is the first part. The second one is, how do we account, let's say, for a claim or a record in a way that, and the ultimate goal is to avoid double counting, but it doesn't mean that double counting doesn't necessarily happen. It means that we can see that something has been double counted, and so the next step is just reconcile it so that it's not double accounted. So there's definitely there needs to be redundancy and overlap in some of the information systems, but we need to be able to filter through that and say, okay, well, at the end of the day, if it goes into an inventory, it only needs to be counted once. Even though it was published in a registry, even though that information also shows up in a satellite for a totally different analysis. So being able to keep track of where things land for automatic reconciliations is second to very important value. On a totally different line, coming in from the side is the financial world, and distributed ledger technologies allowing peer-to-peer financial systems and digital currencies. And so eventually then these come together to say, well, now that you've done your audit trail and made sure that you followed a certain methodology, that asset got accounted, maybe got accounted somewhere else by someone, but at least now they're reconciled because they're visible. How did all the financing of this happen, and who was involved, and how do we automate that? And how do we also define rules for incentives for all the different agents that were involved in ensuring that was robust data, in checking that this was properly reconciled, and at the bottom, land stewards, how they have incentives to be able to do to bring their work into the market in a way that also is non-costly. So historically, our analog way of dealing with ecosystem service credits or carbon credits are expensive, and more often than not in the voluntary carbon market world, they don't get done through the proper methodologies because it's a higher cost. So automation is a key part. So to summarize, I would say it's the data audit trails, it's the accounting framework and reconciliation, and it's the automation with the financial mechanisms that fall into rules for incentive. We may come up with more. Those are the ones that come to mind at the moment. Obviously, a big part of that is how does that link at the global level, just the way that you said it, the global domain, the atmosphere, and the national and subnational. Those just fall also into that framework that gets determined within the same ledger system. It's not like one single ledger, but, and this has also been, just to put another point in there, the importance of interblockchain communication that Region's been focusing on so much, so that what becomes very important is the protocol on how do we listen to everything that's happening on different ledgers.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, great. Well, so what I'm taking away, just distilling what you were talking about, there's sort of auditability of data and claims, insurance and reconciliation of double counting issues, and then plugging those two things directly into financial market instruments, as three really important attributes that distributed ledger, that doing things in PDFs and Excel spreadsheets does not allow for those three things to take place. So yeah, I'm just in heated agreement. I mean, those are the three core pieces that we feel like, at Regen Network, we have to be able to provide that as a service to anyone who's engaging with Regen Network, so that is the nature of the engagement that they're, I like to sort of say, if we can lower the marginal cost of auditing a claim about ecological state to as close to zero as possible, we'll have a functional system for climate finance and climate accounting. But without that, the higher the cost to do an audit, the more sort of middle, sort of opacity and middlemen in the system who may rent seek or have incentives get distorted, and all of these other things start to become very hard. It's very hard to move things forward. So that sort of prime directive here, from my perspective, is, if we could achieve zero cost claims auditing for ecological state, we would be, we'd be in a fantastic place for carbon.
And it's a function for equity, because it's what helps democratize robust accounting, so that it's not something that you can do in an elite, costly environment with top accounting firms. It's something that the community needs to be able to access, because it's also what allows that community to participate, and that's what we need to achieve.
Yeah, so there's a question in the chat about, so wait, there's no unified carbon accounting standard that everybody just follows for, all carbon claims? So I'd love you to speak to that. What's the status or state of carbon accounting standards? How is this evolving right now?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how one looks at it. From the international space, creating inventories and accounting standards, someone would say, of course there is. The IPCC laid out very clearly how you should do your inventory, and that applies to countries and also to companies as well. And the greenhouse gas protocol has been adapted for long periods of time. But at the same time, those are still sort of like high level, and they are designed as frameworks. As soon as we go into the detail, data collection processes and standards there, things get a bit more complicated. And then on the voluntary carbon market space, there's been a lot of flexibility for standards, independent standards to be set, and this is something that Regions has explored and showcased, how following certain lines and logics that around a methodology, you can create sort of new standards. And this is all a function because things are a bit siloed. The international space has its own sort of niche. The companies and NGOs work together on some form of standard setting, and CDP helps lead some of those, and the World Resource Institute has been putting out standards. But then you have the voluntary carbon market that does its own things, and so I would say the simple answer is no, there isn't a global aligned carbon standard. And if I would have to venture into the future, I would say there probably won't be. What we need to agree is it's kind of like a standard of standards, or a protocol in which all these different standards at least can translate and talk to each other. And the best analogies that probably we can find around this are in the internet. There isn't one sort of like email system, but there's SMTP as a protocol that helps all the email systems talk to each other, so that my email from Google arrives to your email in Microsoft. And a lot of that is being able to register all those standards and being able to map out how they translate and equivalencies between themselves. And so that's where we've been looking at, because it's also in the nature of collaboration, right? To be able to establish large systems, large planetary systems, if you want to do it sort of top down and you put a cutting edge team to look at all the standards and then come up with a single standard to rule them all, it's going to be really hard to adopt that. Every standard is going to resist it in some sense. That's just a bit of like human nature. So how do you create that sort of global collaboration? And by thinking on how do we establish sort of mechanisms by which, for example, region develops a new standard for soil carbon that contributes to that ecosystem, and someone else creates, like where we work on establishing a standard for once you retire something, how does this roll up to the from the local to the subnational to the national and global level. That also becomes part of a standard ecosystem. And these can naturally, if they're properly tagged, they could be sort of like automatically filed in like a standards yellow pages. And I think that's a big push of where we need to go. And there's a lot of lessons from the DLT space that we could borrow, because it's again, it's like, how do we establish a decentralized mechanism that we all agree, and the governance of it? Because the other thing about doing a top-down standard of standards that rules them all is that it becomes static, and then in 20 years from now we have to change it, and now we build all our legacy systems around it, and we're going to have to do more and more granular, robust accounting for the next 100 years. Every single emission trajectory to 1.5 gets us to net zero by 2050, but then goes to like way negative to 2100. That is the pathway we need to follow. So between now and 2100, we're going to do this every day and every year. Just to add another analogy there, the financial world, publicly traded firms do robust accounting 4 times a year and publish their quarterly reports. But yet on the global stocktaking process, we want to do them once every 5 years, which is the heartbeat of how the Paris Agreement's been designed. We have to look at how do we eventually get to a point where this is done in real time. And it's a bit of that digital data integration that empowers that. That's why we were able to do robust financial accounting and get that audited relatively fast, because all of our cash flows in our banks get connected into our accounting system and then exported into the right format that the audit reviews. So it's kind of the way that even though sometimes it produces a resistance to do a lot of analogies with the conventional financial system to look at Earth and climate, but it's a way of how do we pay taxes on Earth?
Yeah. Awesome. Well, this has been really illuminating, Martin. Thank you for taking time. I know we could keep digging into this topic for hours, and I'm sure there's a number of different, it's just sort of like just opening up the surface of this whole world of dynamic, adaptive climate accounting, and sort of how to nest it all together. I'm really excited. Do you want to let people know where they can follow your work at Open Earth Foundation before we shift gears here into the next session?
Yeah, we are slow at publishing things, but put the URL there. And our role is to think about that Earth level digital infrastructure that's open. Not that we would single-handedly, but we have to collaborate with groups that, like Region, that are doing and building these ecosystems to ensure that eventually all of this converges. So it's also very important, I think, to navigate this space is always great to think from the planet down as well, in how we think about these systems, because that gives us a bit of hints on how do we set up the processes in, let's say, independent registries and independent methodologies, so that eventually when the world's ready for all of these things to converge, from a digital standpoint, everything's kind of ready. And I also think that the space in which Regions is at is a perfect pocket to showcase a bit of a fractal of what that global system could look like. I don't think we can go in and create this monolithic, huge network from the get-go, but we can establish some fractal deployments. I just see their digital twin for Earth, where at least we start building a common model where we can test these fractals. That's definitely something that we're very focused on. So we'll continue, obviously, collaborating with Region, and anyone in the audience that's more interested in our work, feel free to shoot an email also there through the foundation. And again, congrats. Very excited, very, very proud to see Region get to this very important milestone, and look forward to more.
Thanks, Martin. Look forward to chatting with you again soon.
Right on. Thank you, everyone. We're going to go ahead and move into some closing remarks with Gregory and Sarah and Christian, and then we're going to have two bonus sessions. Another group of validators will be joining us. We're really excited about, and then we'll actually be teaching you how to stake your Regen tokens to close out today. So, Martin,